Anchor, Chapter 2. It was 2 days before she saw Yang again. 2 very long days. Granted, it wasn't like there was much else to occupy Blake's time. She did have some things to keep her occupied, like reading and looking up places to send her resume. It was usually only during lapses in her concentration that the memory of those lilac eyes would slip into her mind. Each night, as she drifted off to sleep, she'd remember those sure hands at her waist and the promise they held. "Sweetheart, I'm not going to hurt you." They had been words her anxious mind had clung to. How had Yang known that they had been the right words to say? The day after the race, her parents had taken her back to that pier. They'd wanted to take some pictures and take a lunch to one of the picnic tables there. Blake had wandered back to the rocks, half expecting to hear Yang's whistle screech through the breeze. Nobody had been there, of course. The rest of her thoughts were so dull, so dead, that it wasn't any wonder that Blake had felt drawn to the ones in shades of gold and violet. Each day, Callie would inevitably try to rouse Blake from her stupor on the couch. In the end, her mother was probably the only reason she got up at all, to shower or even eat. If Blake had truly been there, if she had truly been alive, she might have been able to see that there was more than just frustration in her mother's eyes. Blake was blind to both the sadness and the love. During a rare moment of wakefulness the next day, Blake had pulled up the website for Xiaolong shipyard. Yang had claimed to work there, but that wasn't the reason she'd looked it up. Well, that's what she told herself anyway, as she scanned the pictures. Most of the pictures were of the projects they'd done, the boats they'd built. The shipyard had been started in the 1940s, the site read, by Jinyang Xiaolong. They built and restored many different kinds of boats that Blake had never heard of before, but she zeroed in on the word yacht. She clicked through the menu, only stopping when she did see a name she recognized, Crescent Rose. And there the sailboat was, in all its glory. On its deck stood 2 women, the dark-haired one holding up 2 fingers in a peace sign. The other woman had long white hair, tied into a ponytail. Neither of them was Yang. There was no caption to the image, but the boat's name was a link. Blake clicked it, and she raised her eyebrows in surprise. Crescent Rose had a Facebook page, with 146 likes. This had more photos of the boat, as well as some of the 2 women from the shipyard's website. Blake scrolled, studying the status updates and photo captions. The last update had been from the day before the race. "Wish us luck at the race tomorrow," it read. "If you're in town, come to the pier at 9 a.m. Come watch Crescent Rose kick some booty in person." It was interesting that the page hadn't updated with the results. Without thinking, Blake clicked the page's like button before clicking the Photos tab. Ruby Rose and Weiss Schnee were the 2-woman team that ran Crescent Rose, she learned as she browsed. From the pictures, Ruby seemed to be the playful one, always throwing up a peace sign or making goofy faces for the camera. The other woman, Weiss, seemed more subdued, angling herself in a way that made it seem like she knew how to take a good picture. Funny, too, that for being Yang's sister, Ruby looked almost nothing like her. There were some similarities in the wildness of their eyes, in their smile, and their cheekbones, but for the most part, they didn't even look related. She stopped at one picture. The aviators hid Yang's eyes, but the messy blonde hair was familiar. Yang leaned against Crescent Rose's mast, looking relaxed and holding a drink can. Her green flannel shirt was open, exposing a white bikini top and abs that Blake stared at for longer than she'd ever be willing to admit. Shit, why did she have to be beautiful? "Yang, my big sister who outbuilt Crescent Rose," the caption read. Blake stared at the picture, remembering all too quickly how real this woman had been. The porcelain shard felt heavy in her pocket. She forced herself to click to the next picture, Ruby and Weiss posing on the deck of the boat. In the background, Yang had grabbed onto one of the many ropes connected to the mast, in the same green flannel and denim shorts as the picture before. Though she wasn't facing the camera this time, Blake was focused more on her than the 2 women in the foreground. Blake closed the window, cheeks pink. It was stupid to be so enthralled over someone she met only once. It had to be because she was lonely, she decided. That was all. She was fixating on this woman out of loneliness, which couldn't be a healthy thing to do. God, how could she be so pathetic? It was incentive, at least, to get out of the house. Laptop stowed in her bag, Blake asked her parents to drop her off at the diner for lunch the next day. This, she reasoned, would at least get her back into the world. Even if she wasn't up to meeting anyone, she'd at least be around other people. Callie could hardly contain her pleasure that her daughter was finally leaving the house. "It does seem to be the cool spot for the younger people," she remarked as they made their way up the hill to the diner. "They've got free Wi-Fi," Blake replied with a shrug, "and I'm in the mood for a burger." "Well, maybe you'll meet some friends today," Callie smiled at her daughter. Blake didn't return it. Her mother was too optimistic. The same shroud of gray settled around Blake as she set her laptop up at one of the booths. Job applications, she reminded herself. What a joke. She couldn't even concentrate long enough to fill out her name, let alone her employment history. Still, she had to try. The idea of being her parents' charity case for the rest of her life wasn't a pleasant notion. Even the sounds around her were muted. She was aware of happy chatter coming from the direction of the kitchen, but she ignored it as she reached for her earbuds. She put one in, but before she could put in the other, she heard a name that made her cat ears twitch. Only because Yang wanted to take us to Portland. We had to crash at Piers because Weiss got wasted. Discreetly, Blake lifted her eyes over her screen. At the wide window into the kitchen, the goofy young woman from Crescent Rose's Facebook page was chattering to the blonde cashier. "She's been doing that a lot lately," the blonde man said. There was worry in his voice, and she saw Ruby nod unhappily. "The thing with her dad really messed her up, but it's not affecting her job or the races, so there isn't really much I can say about it." The upset expression on Ruby's face looked so out of place on someone who seemed so cheerful in photos. "But it was bad the other night. She got to Piers and she, immediately started puking. Yang felt so bad that she'd taken us out at all. It's not like it was her fault." "But you know how she gets sometimes," Ruby shrugged. "It was nice to see Pyrrha, though, even though Weiss kind of ruined it." For one terrifying moment, Blake's eyes locked with Ruby's unsettling silver ones. Had she been caught eavesdropping? God, she wished she could stop the heat from creeping into her cheeks. Footsteps, and Blake hunched her shoulders reflexively, prepared for confrontation. "Sorry if we were talking too loud," Ruby smiled sheepishly when she approached Blake's booth. "No, it's fine." Blake couldn't figure out how Ruby was apologizing for her own eavesdropping. Ruby furrowed her brows as she regarded Blake, then she broke into a grin. "Oh, I remember you now! You were here the other night, right? I remember because of the ears." She stuck up her hands, using her fingers to mimic cat ears. Hesitantly, Blake smiled. "Right." "It's good to see you again." Blake. My name's Blake." "Blake, of course!" Ruby's face lit up, and for a moment that made her gut clench. Blake wondered if Yang had brought her up in conversation. Would that have been a good thing if she did? In the end, it didn't matter. "You liked Crescent Rose's Facebook page." Blake blushed. Yeah, I did. I saw your race the other day." "We kicked butt, didn't we?" Ruby preened. "I get so excited whenever I see someone else liked the page. I remembered your name." Blake laughed weakly. "You caught me." "So, are you staying on Patch?" Ruby asked, taking a seat across from her. Blake nodded, then shut her laptop. She would have guessed from the photos that Ruby would be an outgoing person, and she wouldn't have been wrong. She wished the younger woman would leave her in peace, but Blake was no good at shutting down conversations. "Yeah, 8 weeks. "Oh, nice! So that means we can actually get to know you. We get so many people here who just stay for, a weekend or something. It's the people who stay for the whole summer that are really worth getting to know, though. That's how I met Weiss." "She races with you, right?" "Yep." The table started to wiggle a little. Ruby must have been bouncing her leg underneath. "She was a summer person, but she moved in with us last year. Her dad's kind of an asshole." This last word was delivered in a stage whisper. "That sucks." Blake drummed her fingers on her laptop, which caught Ruby's attention. "What you doing?" "Job applications." "Ooh, I thought you might have been one of those writer types who comes to Maine and tries to, channel Stephen King's vibes or something." Ruby laughed, a tinkling noise that might have been similar to Yang's. "Ruby!" an exasperated voice called. "We don't pay you to sit with the customers." "Sorry!" Ruby jumped back up. "It was nice to meet you. Want to hang out sometime?" "What?" "I could give you a little tour of the shipyard, and you could meet Crescent Rose, too." If it was possible to use heart emojis in a verbal sentence, she would have been sure Ruby would have done so. Her silver eyes positively glittered when she spoke of the boat. For all she wanted to say no, all she could imagine was her parents' disappointment if she did. She had to make some kind of effort. Besides, if she had to, she could always cancel these future get-togethers. I guess." "Yay!" Ruby beamed. "What are you doing this afternoon? I get off in an hour, and we could walk to the shipyard together." It's not that far, just half a mile." Blake looked back at her laptop, considering. Her parents would be pleased if she did, she thought wryly. And Ruby didn't give her the same anxiety most other strangers would. There was something so innocent about her. Seeing the boat would be interesting as well, she had to admit. Then, of course, there was the slimmest possibility that she would catch a glimpse of Yang. She did say she lived by the shipyard, and Ruby was her sister after all. "Okay," she agreed. An hour and a text to her parents later, Blake found herself following Ruby down the hill toward the shipyard. At first, Ruby's pace was too fast. It wasn't a sprint, but Ruby ended up doubling back several times when she'd gotten too far ahead. "Sorry," Blake said, stopping for a moment. She put a hand on the sore spot. "I cracked my ribs a few weeks ago, and I'm not supposed to work them too hard." "That's awful!" Ruby's eyes widened. "I'm sorry. I'll try to walk slower. How'd you do that?" "It's sort of a long story." Blake grimaced automatically. Ruby nodded, looking more serious than she'd seen yet, and pressed no further. Arriving on foot to a quiet shipyard was much different than arriving by car to a busy one. It was much emptier than it had been over the weekend. The large pier was empty, save for a couple people on the picnic tables. They might have been workers on break. Out in the harbor, boats were moored while the nearby docks had yet more boats tied up. "That's Yang's boat," Ruby said, pointing to a dingy-looking vessel at the dock. "Yang?" Blake was relieved that Ruby didn't seem to notice the way her ears perked up. "Oh, yeah, my sister, Yang. She works here. She helped build Crescent Rose, actually." She led Blake down the dirt road. Maybe I can introduce you. Anyway, that's her boat, but she didn't build it. She mostly uses it to go lobstering. Lobstering? You know, catching lobster. Ruby shrugged, having apparently mistaken Blake's incredulity for ignorance. A bunch of people here do it. She doesn't really do it for profit, but she loves it. That's pretty cool. Blake stopped them by a small building and poked her head in the door. Weiss, I made a new friend. Good for you. I'm busy. If Blake hadn't been a faunus, she might not have heard the other end of Ruby's conversation. Don't you want to meet her? Maybe later. I really need to get this paperwork done. Boo, that's so boring. Ruby wrinkled her nose. I'm going to show her Crescent Rose. Don't let her touch anything, Weiss warned. I was going to let her take it out, and then I'd have to kill you. Ruby stuck out her tongue, then turned back to Blake. Sorry, maybe you can meet Weiss another day. Blake wasn't sure when she had started smiling, but the muscles in her face ached in protest at the strange sensation. I'd love to. Ruby led her down to the docks, bouncing past Yang's Ember Silica to get to the much prettier, sleeker Crescent Rose. What you think? Ruby asked, giddily. She hopped aboard with ease. You can climb on if you want. After a moment's hesitation, Blake gripped the side and carefully stepped aboard. She should have been ready for the way the boat rocked on the water, but actually experiencing was different. She stood as still as she could, gripping a metal fixture on the side of the boat to hold her steady. Ruby needed no such help. She zipped across the deck, stepping over ropes as if the rocking ocean was no factor in her movements. With light slaps on the various parts, Ruby gave her a short lesson on the parts of the boat. Blake could retain none of them as she looked at the naked mast. It was as though Ruby was speaking in a foreign language, and it all went over Blake's head. If you want, I can show you our trophies and ribbons. They're back in Weiss's office, she explained. We've got a lot. Oh, and we've got another race next week in Rockport. Where's that? Blake wasn't that curious about small Maine towns, but the conversation was horribly one-ended. She needed to contribute somehow. She sat down and looked over the other side of the boat, where there was a better view of the harbor. Across the way, Blake could see quaint summer cottages dotting the shore between the vibrant evergreens. On this clear summer day, she could understand what drew people to this quiet state. The day she arrived may have been gloomy, but on a day like this, she could begin to enjoy the scenery. On the gently rolling water, she could pick out points of color. Buoys, she thought. She didn't know they came in so many colors, and she wondered what they meant. I was just giving her a hard time, Ruby whined. Blake gave a start. She hadn't realized she'd completely tuned out the smaller girl. She whirled, and her stomach flopped. Yang, hair pulled up and a hand on her hip, was smirking at her sister from the dock. Blake's sudden movement caught her eye, and her smirk changed into a bright smile. Hey, Blake. Hi, Yang. Wait, do you guys know each other already? Ruby looked between them, her lower lip bulging out in a pout. We met at the race the other day. I was hoping I'd see you again, sweetheart. The fine hairs on the back of Blake's neck rose. There was that word again. She could almost see the hidden meaning to it, the reminder of the way she'd acted when Yang got her off the rock. With that word was the reassurance of the promise she'd made. I'm not going to hurt you. That it still stood. Her eyes were so soft. Oh, you should have told me! Ruby wrinkled her nose. I didn't think it mattered, Blake said, shrugging, trying not to betray the trepidation she felt. Ouch! Yang's grin widened by a fraction. Good to know I made an impression. God, if only she knew. Have you offered our guest a drink, Roops? Yang tutted at Ruby's cringe. So rude. I thought I'd taught you better manners than that. She wanted to see the boat. Blake, you want anything to drink? I'm going to grab a Coke anyway. Water's fine. Oh, since you're in Maine, you should try Moxie. Ruby grinned wickedly, and Yang made a gagging sound. Ruby, I thought this girl's your friend. If you give her Moxie, she's never going to want to come back. Yang hopped onto the deck to flick Ruby's temple with her finger. You mind grabbing me a Coke, too? You should have brought your own, jerk, she grumbled, pushing her sister out of the way as she stepped back onto the dock. The shove made something low in Yang's chest catch in the sunlight, and Blake realized that even though it wasn't racing day, Yang still wore a whistle. I'll be right back. Oh! She rounded back on Yang, jutting at Blake with her head. Don't do anything mean, like knocking her overboard, okay? She busted her ribs pretty recently and has to take it easy. A look of concern crossed over Yang's face, and Blake wanted to melt into the floor, or maybe just throw herself into the ocean. She didn't want pity, but she had a feeling she was going to get it anyway. She wished Ruby had kept her mouth shut. They're broken? Yang asked, her voice low. Shit, and I had you climbing around on rocks. I didn't exactly tell you, Blake pointed out, and it was fine. Yeah, but you could have really hurt yourself. Yang treaded lightly across the boat, sinking onto the bench beside her. All playfulness had left her features as she regarded Blake intently, too intently. Silence bubbled between them, one that made Blake more aware than ever of the burning knot of anxiety in her stomach and Yang's scent. God, she was close enough to smell the sawdust, the chemicals, the sweat, and underlying something like citrus. She wondered where the citrus came from. What happened? Yang finally asked. The ocean. She had to just keep her eyes on the ocean and hope her face wasn't red enough to give anything away. is complicated, she said stiffly. You don't have to tell me, Yang replied in a rush, forcing a smile. I'm just nosy. Blake shrugged. It's nothing. She risked a look back up at her, slightly surprised that Yang was still focused on her, just as intent as before, just as kind. She nodded in understanding, her blonde ponytail bouncing. I was hoping I'd get to see you again, Yang finally went on. The tension broke as the relaxed tone returned to her voice and the smile reappeared. Why? Blake asked, frowning, finding and clinging to suspicion. Yang shrugged, setting a hand on the bench between them. Though the hand was close to her thigh, Blake resisted the urge to pull it away. Yang had touched her before, hadn't she? It had been a nice touch. That, at least, she could admit. Maybe it wouldn't be a bad thing if Yang accidentally touched her again. This thought may have been completely at odds with her constant fear, but her skin craved something gentle. I don't know yet, Yang replied cheerfully. Maybe, if we get to know each other better, I'll find a reason. Blake blew a loud exhale through her lips, trying to stop the amused smile that tried to spread there. You think you're pretty smooth, huh? I'm very smooth. The contagion of Yang's smile was too hard to fight anymore, and Blake finally returned it. She made it look so easy. The fingers on the hand closest to Blake drummed on the bench. So, isn't she gorgeous? What? This definitely wasn't the way Blake thought things were going, but okay. She'll play along. She pictured Ruby. She wouldn't have picked the word gorgeous, though the younger woman was pretty enough. I guess she's pretty. Not exactly my type, though. Yang stared at her for a long moment, disbelieving. Then she cracked up. She roared with laughter, doubling over. Blake smiled politely, the laughter infectious enough for her to almost think about doing it herself, even if she didn't understand the joke. Oh my god! Yang wheezed, smacking the side of the bench. I think I'm dying! What? What's so funny? You thought I was talking about Ruby! Yang's face was blotchy with color from the hard laughter. I'm talking about the boat! Good to know you have a type, though. Oh my god. Blake buried her face in her hands, knowing her face would be completely red. I'm such an idiot. Hey, that's not true. Blake looked through her fingers at Yang, whose smile was reassuring. I forget that boat talk takes some getting used to. Cheeks still on fire, Blake lowered her hands. The fact that she had rested her hand even closer to Yang's than it had been before was purely coincidental, but she didn't move it. Yang looked down at it, her expression as warm as ever. I've been wondering about you, she finally said, eyes finding Blake's again. Have you? Blake asked breathlessly. There was no pressure in Yang's smile, no expectation. It was the same smile she'd worn while offering that piece of porcelain in the palm of her hand. You know, most people come to Maine to eat a lobster roll and go to the beach, or watch the boats. Blake couldn't have broken their stare even if she'd tried. Those light eyes had pulled her into their riptide, drowning her. But you came to the rocks, which is probably more Maine than all those other things. I was just trying to get away from the crowd. And you went to the rocks, and you followed me. Blake gulped. This was a precipice of some kind, and she was teetering on the edge. She couldn't remember the last time just talking to someone made her feel like this. They weren't even touching. They didn't need to. A breeze picked up, playing with the blonde strands that had escaped Yang's ponytail. Blake's own hair whipped across her face, and she quickly tucked some behind her ear. So? She asked, breaking the eye contact at last. It was just too much. So? Yang repeated, amused. You stuck out to me. But then, when you were coming down from the rock, Blake cringed, wishing that this wasn't being brought up. Can we not talk about that? Yang said nothing. Instead, she slowly reached her fingers up to brush the bangs back from Blake's face. Blake winced on instinct, even though the touch barely grazed her skin. She lifted her eyes back to Yang's, expecting to see irritation at the interruption, or expecting her to suddenly yank at the hair she was smoothing into place. Yet none of that was there. None of the aggression or violence that she had come to expect with touch. The pads of Yang's fingertips were soft on her temple. And then the hand was gone, Yang withdrawing it from Blake's hair with a thoughtful expression. We don't have to, she said with a shrug. Belatedly, Blake realized that it wasn't fear that was making her heart pound. I was just worried, I guess. Don't be. I'm fine. Blake folded her arms across her chest. You don't even know me anyways. Maybe we can fix that? Yang asked, smoothly steering the conversation into something new, something hopeful. I'm off tomorrow afternoon, if you're interested. For what, a date or something? If that's what you want. Yang's smile seemed so relaxed, so open, that Blake only stared. She didn't know what she'd expected, so she didn't know what to say. She opened her mouth slightly, but no sound came out. Got him! Ruby announced, and Blake twitched, jerking away from Yang like she'd been caught doing something illegal. Coke's for us, water for Blake! Awesome! Thanks, sis, Yang said, taking one of the Coke cans from her sister. And thank you for not bringing the Moxie. We were out anyways. Ruby sighed, handing Blake a water bottle. I think Pete drank them all. Moxie, the drink for old men. Yang shook her head in amusement, holding her can up as if in toast. What is Moxie? Blake managed to ask, though her brain was still stuck on Yang's offer.
It's like the nastiest soda, and it's only a main thing. It's like the state beverage, Ruby explained.
No, that's Ellen's coffee brandy, Yang corrected. Ruby groaned.
Please don't say those words again, she begged.
Ruby drank way too much of it a few weeks ago, and I guess she's swearing off the stuff for good or something, Yang snorted, taking a sip of her Coke. It tastes a lot better than Moxie, though. You guys are so mean, Blake remarked, shaking her head. The sisters laughed. For a few minutes, conversation was light and pleasant. They spoke of the sailboats, of the upcoming races that summer. Ruby went into detail about the recent race, not holding back on her brag about leaving her biggest rival, Sharp Retribution, in the dust. All three of them were laughing, and Blake couldn't remember the last time she'd truly done that with anyone. Before today, she'd been convinced her laughter had been left behind on Menagerie. She was relieved it was still inside her after all. Well, I should probably get back to work, Yang said with an exaggerated sigh. Blake was alarmed by how disappointed she was in this declaration, but she took heart in the smile Yang gave her. It was a different sort of smile than the one she used on Ruby. This was more gentle, an almost private sort of thing. And it was hers. It was good seeing you, Blake told her, and Yang laughed. Don't say it like that. I'm seeing you tomorrow, right? Ruby's dark eyebrows raised, interested. Oh? There was a split second where Blake considered backing out, saying no, but she couldn't. She already knew she needed to see Yang again, and that need scared her. Still. Yeah, okay. Where am I picking you up? With a quick glance at Ruby, as if to make sure this was okay, Blake rattled off the address of the cottage. Ruby narrowed her eyes at her sister, but said nothing. I'll pick you up around 2. You might want to wear a swimsuit, but bring sneakers, Yang instructed. She gave Blake a long look, full of her smile. I'm looking forward to it. Me too, Blake stammered.
Is this a date or something?
Ruby finally asked, suspicious. To her surprise, Yang blushed, a pretty color tinting her cheeks. It was a date, Blake realized then. It was, and, stranger still, she didn't regret that it was. Somehow, she was glad. I guess so, she said, eyes meeting Yang's. Her stomach fluttered at the look Yang returned to her. It wasn't just the softness, the warmth that Blake loved so much. It was the joy that seemed to encompass it all. Then I'll see you tomorrow, she replied, her voice low. Blake's stare after her might have been too obvious, for she heard Ruby snickering at her. She didn't care. She wished she had the words to describe the way she felt as Yang vanished into the tall building. It was completely unfamiliar, but the fact that it was there at all meant something. Until now, there hadn't been any light in her life. Everything had been so dull, so dark. But Yang could have been sunlight. Later that night, from her nest on the couch, she saw Ruby had sent her a friend request on Facebook, presumably finding her on Crescent Rose's page. With a strange lightness in her heart, she accepted. Not even 5 minutes later, she got a second notification. Yang Xiaolong has sent you a friend request. What are you smiling about, honey? Callie asked, almost daring to be cheerful as she passed through the living room. Nothing, Blake said, shaking her head. She clicked accept. End of chapter.